It's Friday, the 5th of April, 2024.
The last word in podcasting news. This is the Pod News Weekly Review with James Cridlin and Sam Sethi.
Yes, I'm James Cridlin, the editor of Pod News here in Australia.
And I'm Sam Sethi, the CEO of True Fans back in England.
Yes, in the chapters today, the Podcast Standards Project. There was a meet in Los Angeles with news from that. mowPod, get caught, gaming the numbers. YouTube, did they finally say something interesting? Google Podcasts closes, kind of, except it hasn't really, except it kind of has. US podcast listening has hit an all-time high, and Spotify is to launch new pricing plans. This podcast is sponsored by Buzzsprout, podcast hosting made easy with easy and powerful tools, free learning materials, remarkable customer support, and a new iOS app.
From your daily newsletter, the Pod News Weekly Review.
So, James, the Podcast Standards Project, what is that, James?
What is that indeed? It's been going for, 18 months, I think? And,
yeah, roughly.
Yeah, I think. And so it's a group dedicated to creating standards and practices that improve the open podcasting ecosystem for both listeners and creators. I've always thought of it kind of as being a industry group that takes what Podcasting 2.0 has been doing and works out what should be what should be worked on a wider scale, and tries to corral individual podcast hosts and podcast apps and all of that kind of stuff together.
Yeah, that sounds roughly what it does.
But I should be asking you, for you are the new chief evangelist for the Podcast Standards Project.
Yes. You know that thing where they say everyone who wants to volunteer take one step forward and everyone goes one step back?
Yes, that wasn't you there, was it?
No, I actually wanted to do this role. I did genuinely want this role because I've looked at it like you for the last 18 months thinking what I wanted to see was somebody, and I didn't think it was going to be me, somebody to take a leading role in trying to make what I think is a really good idea, effective across the industry with an inward marketing look. This is talking to all the hosts, talking to all the apps, and, as you said, corralling them into, nudging them onto what they should be doing in terms of what tags are there and what we're doing. And then an external role, because one of the things I observed at LA was the ambies. Now, I don't know if you popped your head into the ambies at all, did you?
I did not.
No. So for the American Podcast Awards, what I noticed was that
yes,
all the people who were queuing there, I've never seen. I wouldn't know. I didn't know a single soul. And it made me realise if I asked any one of those people there in the queue as they were going into the ambience, have you ever heard of Podcasting 2.0? I'm pretty sure the answer would have been no. And then when I looked around after the people who got all their awards went home, all the new producers and directors, and I looked around Evolution, the crowd that stayed for the 2 days that were there, or 3 days, and if I'd gone to many of them, they might have heard what Podcasting 2.0 is, but probably wouldn't have been sure how to define it, or couldn't even name a few tags within it. So I thought the role for the Podcast Standards Project needed somebody who was going to be able to talk inwardly to hosts and app providers, but externally to the people who went to the ambies and the people who are interested in Podcasting 2.0, but just need a little bit of information that will give them the next step to take it on. So that's what I thought the role is. And so, I've stepped up, and we'll see. I've got a year. And we'll see what happens in that year.
Yeah, so I think, from my point of view, I've always saw the Podcast Standards Project as basically looking at a very small subset of tags, and to focus on those tags and go, okay, we want as many people as possible to support these 5 tags or these 10 tags or whatever it might be. So it's very different to Podcasting 2.0, which has all kinds of tags, some of which don't work. The podcast images tag, for example, is something that should be deleted, in my humble opinion. But still, there we are. So I've always seen the Podcast Standards Project as being something which is essentially a filter that actually really pushes for wide adoption. So what are you? How are you going to see the difference between talking about podcasting 2.0, which you'll be doing, of course, for true fans, and talking about the podcast standards project, which is, my understanding is there are only 5 tags that they've currently had a look at.
Yeah, I sort of liken the podcast 2.0 group, the geeks that focus on their, phase 7 or whatever you want to call it, that's currently going through, as the R&D arm of podcasting. They're pushing really hard on the future, and they're probably somewhere between 12 to 18 months ahead of what the PSP should be doing. So if you look at the PSP, the tags that, they agreed probably a year ago, podcast TXT, the funding tag, transcripts, the lock tag, and GUID. And they are really low hanging fruit. Everyone should be there. And I think when I looked at all the hosts, pretty much, of the main ones that are going to do anything, they are all close there. So I think there'll be a press release out shortly, and that's one of the other things that you told me, James, was, you need to put the noise out. Even if you do the work, put the noise out. So I think we're going to be trying to put at least 1, if not 2, press releases out across the industry to show some momentum. And I know with the PSP 1.1, the next version, the 5 tags that are being looked at are medium, podping, podroll, person, and chapters. And again, I don't think they're rocket science tags to be looking at. I think they're pretty good tags. They're low hanging, and I think they add a great deal of value to the listener. So hopefully those will be before the summer, certainly the ones that, and when I again look at the hosts, I think one thing that's very different when I've gone back through all the correspondence on what was Basecamp, people were saying, I don't know, if I put this in, it won't appear in Apple, and then I'll get customer support problems. And I think since then, I think a lot of hosts have gone, look, let's just get on with it. Captivate, Blueberry, Podhome, RSS.com, Buzzsprout, they've all pretty much got even the next generation of tags already implemented. So I don't think the problem is now implementing tags. I think it's now making sure that those people who are left behind, when I was in the army, we used to say, never leave the last man behind. I think that's going to be more of my challenge. Getting the slow laggards up to speed rather than the people who are leading the charge. Yeah,
and to me, I think that there are 2 things. I think, firstly, with due deference to true fans, these tags need to be supported by podcast players that people are actually using. And Podfriend and Curiocaster and Podverse are not those. And it would be nice to see rather more, larger podcast apps using things. For example, we've just heard this week that Pocket Casts is going to be implementing the new super chapters thing. JSON chapters, call them what you will. That's good news, I think, from that point of view. So actually seeing more podcast players using these tags is, I think, going to be a good thing. I think also we should be focusing, or you should be focusing on not just people like Megaphone and Libsyn and all of these other heritage podcast hosts which aren't implementing these tags, but also talking to some of the large broadcasters, because people who host themselves, like PRX, like the BBC, like the ABC here in Australia, they really also need significant help to actually get there too. So I think it's going to be a hard slog, but it's going to be really helpful if that's actually done. So many congratulations. Wish you luck with that. That'll be fun.
Yes. We'll see how many white hairs I get before the end of the year. Now, look, let's move on. mowPod, not a group that I really know a lot about, again, but they've done something a little bit naughty, James. Tell me more.
Yes, so they had a product which we looked at last year, which is fine. It's advertising shows within, ad banners on websites, and that's all good and fine and works quite well, and seems to be, so far as I could work out, entirely compliant with absolutely everything that everybody would expect. But They also have a product which they don't talk about, which I actually asked the CEO, Mike Whiston, about last year, and he said, no, we haven't got anything like that. And this particular non-public product is essentially something that appears in games when you need another life, or you need another skin for your character, or maybe you need another go or some coins or something. Then you can press various things. You can, watch this ad and get some points, or in mowPod's case, follow a podcast and get some points. And so there's a way, not quite sure how they do it, where you are asked, if you want 10,000 points, then just go and follow this particular show in Apple Podcasts, which is an interesting way of driving both more downloads, because obviously Apple Podcasts has auto downloads by default, which in my humble opinion it shouldn't, but anyway, let's not go there, but which also manipulates chart placings as well, because Apple Podcasts basically works out its podcast charts by recent follows. And Ashley Carman did some great work on digging into this. She's discovered that at least 9 of the top 50 shows have been promoted in this way by giving extra lives and game credits and stuff like that. And it all looks a little bit fishy. Now, Mike Whiston, the CEO, did speak to us about it, and he said, well, Ashley's article was very unfair. He says that gamers are on average 35 years old with a 70 grand household income. Don't care, Mike. And secondly, that the subscriptions are intentional, he claims, based on a choice and a low click-through rate from an in-app offer wall. So basically you get offered 10 different things that you might want to go and do to earn some credits, and following a podcast is one of those things, and not very many people click. Again, don't really care too much, to be honest. I don't quite understand why he's not publicly talking about this particular thing if it's all if it's all above board. What do you think of this, Sam?
In a sentence, can I call bullshit on Mr. Whiston? If it's so legitimate and not totally scammy, then why is it not public? And there's no better than, one of the things I get on LinkedIn is, Indian podcast promoter, I'll get you to the top of the Apple charts. Well, I mean, this is no better. This is no better.
Yeah.
And why are they doing this, James? Because we know that download numbers inflate the numbers to advertisers. It can be the only reason. You and I violently agree that time listened is the way that we do it. And there's no way that mowPod could game the time listen unless they told gamers they had to listen to 20 minutes of a podcast before they could get their next skin. So...
Well, I mean, some of them, Ashley has also covered other companies in the past who've done exactly that. I mean, it's worthwhile pointing out the types of companies that are using this. Wondery, iHeart, Lemonada Media, just 3 that are using this particular tool. And yeah, I mean, I look at all of this and I think this is one of the problems with auto downloads. Auto downloads that are on by default. And I wrote a blog post last week, just before I went to Evolutions, basically saying, is it time for Apple Podcasts to turn off auto downloads by default? So you can still turn them on. That's absolutely fine. Go for your life. But for most people, turn them off so that when you press the play button, that's when the audio downloads. There's absolutely no reason with the speed of internet connectivity that we have these days why that is a worse user experience. That would kill all of these silly ways of jumping through hoops stone dead, because, you wouldn't have these auto downloads happening. So I think that's sort of one side. The other thing that I would point out is, and you left Evolutions on Thursday night, the other thing that I would point out is Friday morning, the mowPod stand had been dismantled and had gone. Ooh. There was just a hole there. Now, if you are going to claim that everything that you're doing is above board and everything else, don't run away when somebody publishes a bad story about you. That looks a bit fishy. They were the only company to literally walk away on Friday morning. Now, I don't know whether that was because they were embarrassed about the story or whether they had plans to do that all along. I went and stole a T-shirt from their stand, which had nobody there on Thursday afternoon. And it was a very nice T-shirt. So thank you for that. But again, that looked very strange. That the company, and there were more than one person there, that the company would dismantle their stand on Friday morning so that they weren't asked questions and things. So it's the difference between, and Dan Meisner has said this in the past, it's the difference between buying traffic and buying audience. You can buy traffic very easy, but they won't stick around. You can't buy audience in this way. And I think that that's the big difference there.
Personally, if I was a podcast production house, I would go and find the Apple person, and it is a person, who promotes the new and noteworthy. Take them out for a drink and you'll find yourself in the charts quite quickly. That's a better way of doing it.
Yes, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Talk to those people, give them a good reason to link to them. By the way, if you send details about a new podcast or a new season to Pod News, then I can pretty well guarantee you about 400 downloads to your trailer, because it will go into the new podcasts trailers feed that we have. And so from that point of view, that will be a fun thing too. But, I don't know. It's much better to get proper audience than to get faked audience such as this.
Now let's move on. The last day, actually, I did make it back on Friday morning because YouTube were finally going to make some announcements, we believed, at Podcast Movement. The last couple of times has been a damp squid from YouTube. So, James, we were all there in the room, and Kai and Steve were there. What did they say? What big announcement did YouTube give us?
Well, they, to be fair to them, they did give an announcement, which is that they are planning a set of workshops for creators. I think one of the things that I covered in the Pod News report card was lots of people were very upset at YouTube simply because they didn't know what was going on. And this is what I said to my contact at YouTube when I was speaking to him about the report card, was that actually, we just need to know what's going on. Please communicate with us. It's a different job than communicating with other industries. The podcast industry really does need to be communicated with because we're open, and that's the difference. So they have announced a set of Podcasting 101 workshops. The first one is on April the 26th. Now, it only takes, I think it's an hour, and I think you only have 5 or 10 minutes for questions at the end. But there are going to be questions at the end, so that's going to be good. I won't be waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning to watch it, but nevertheless, it's a great start. What they also showed is a few other things, including a Podcasts for You rail in YouTube, in the main YouTube app, which will be very helpful to push people to listening to podcasts from YouTube, because there's not much of that going on. And also enhancements to the podcast experience in YouTube Music were teased, although they didn't quite say what they were going to be. There's a few enhancements to the API as well, but not particularly, exciting. I mean, at the end of the day, I use YouTube Music for my music app. There is no mention of podcasts in the YouTube Music app at all. Now, Google Podcasts hasn't closed in this country. It's only closed in the US, but there's still no mention of podcasts in the YouTube Music app at all, which is supposed to replace it. So I'm not quite sure what they're playing at. That came as a surprise to my contact at Google as well. So, again, not quite sure what you do there, but yeah. So at least we saw something, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I actually thought Steve, when he started to talk about what they're planning to do in terms of YouTube in the car and some of the other, information that they were giving, I thought, okay, they are trying to get into podcasting.
Yeah.
But, again, is it going to drag me to use it? Probably not. I thought there was a report in Pod News Daily that was quite interesting to read, which was the truth about video podcasts on YouTube. The bottom line was you don't need a video to succeed in podcasting. So I thought that was quite an interesting summary.
Yes. Yes, which was interesting. And I just, the thing that sort of slightly irritated me was the first 10 minutes was Kai Chuck standing there, who's head of podcasts at YouTube, basically standing there saying, look at all of this research saying that YouTube is number one for podcasts. And I'm kind of looking at all of this data and I'm thinking, and you used the phrase earlier on, so I will use it now, it's bullshit. All of this data saying I listen to podcasts on YouTube and it's the number one platform for, Edison say this, Cumulus Media say this. I've seen a number of other Signal Hill Insights say it as well. It's nonsense because the definition of a podcast there is not the same definition as the definition of something that you would listen to in Apple Music or in Spotify or in Pocket Casts or in AntennaPod. It's a different definition. And in terms of total time, yes, I might once listen to, The Rest is Politics or something using YouTube just to see what Alistair and Rory look like. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's my favorite podcast app. The fact that lots of people use YouTube does not mean that YouTube is number one for podcasts. And I think the research that they quote, it doesn't say what they want it to say, which is that more people listen to podcasts in YouTube than anything else. And that's not what it says. It just talks about reach, not about time spent listening. And the definition of podcast is very, very different. So, I don't know. I get a little bit frustrated with this research that comes out, which is just nonsense at the end of the day.
Well, when you see numbers like 84% and 38% of people do X, it all sounds very good when you stand up and present it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Anyway, Google Podcast is now dead in the US only. It's still available in every other country in the world, but it's fascinating to watch how many media outlets in other countries have said Google Podcast has been turned off when it hasn't been. In fact, we don't have a closure date yet for any other country other than the US. David Pearce from The Verge has written an article which is well worth a read, where he basically says the podcast app is only the latest good Google thing to die, and if Google ever wants us to buy into its promises again, this has to stop, he says. And I would entirely agree with that. I've found myself moving away from Google over the last 12 months, and I used to be quite a Google fanboy, and I can't see anything to be a fan of anymore. I'll be honest.
No, I mean, I don't really use Gmail. I do occasionally. I was a big user of Google Maps, but Apple Maps are just as good now, or getting there. Wow. Certainly where I am. Maybe not where you are.
We'll agree to differ on that, but yes.
Yeah, but fundamentally, there's 3 or 4 products left that I use with Google, and then fundamentally, yeah, you're right. I stopped trusting Google when they killed the Google Reader. That was it. That was the big nail in the coffin.
Google Reader was just such a misstep, and then they've made that misstep again and again and again. And when you get, when there's a new app on your Apple iPhone, that app is going to stay there forever. That app is not going to be, gone within 5 years as Google Podcasts was. That was a number 3 podcast app. The number 3 podcast app. Yes, it wasn't used as much as it was, as much as it could have been, partially because they made it really difficult to actually show how much traffic was coming from it. But even so, it was the number 3 podcast app, and they've just killed it and replaced it with something that, as I say, I don't see the word podcast anywhere in YouTube Music, which is supposed to be the replacement.
Well, I don't see podcasts in the word Amazon Music either, by the way, but that's another point.
Well, yes, there's another point.
Now, moving on, the numbers. One of the other presentations at LA was US podcast listening has hit an all-time high. Tell me more, James.
Yes, this was the Infinite Dial, which is the gold standard for podcast consumption. It's been done for many years, I think over 20 years now, and it's a really good piece of data showing how many people are listening to podcasts. The big highlights are 47% of the US population has now listened to a podcast over the last month. That's up 12% year on year. Women listeners up 19% as well. So that's one sort of side of it. The other side of it is that if you take a look at the data from that and compare it to other data, then Cumulus Media and Westwood One say basically podcast is the same size now as TV for 18 to 34s. 48% listen to podcasts each week. 18 to 34s, 50% listen to or watch the TV every single week. Pierre Bouvard has dug out. I would approach that with a slight amount of concern, if only because you're comparing Infinite Dial with other data, but nevertheless, it's the continuation of a story that we've heard. So some great numbers that have come out of that, which is really good, even though you have heard lots of bad things about Apple Podcast downloads, but still more people are listening to podcasts than ever before.
Talking of downloads and Apple, our sponsors and friends at Buzzsprout have released their numbers, and I'm surprised it says downloads from Apple Podcasts are down 39%. So I always find this weird. Podcasting listening is at an all-time high, and yet downloads are going down. What's the difference?
Yeah, because it's the auto downloads. That's basically what that number is. The auto downloads have been removed from Apple Podcasts in some cases, and that's why we're seeing large amounts of drops. I shared data from PodTrack last week showing an overall drop for larger shows of around 15%. Buzzsprout are saying it's down for their network 39% year on year, although basically everything is about 12% down on Buzzsprout year on year for March. 12% fewer episodes. Spotify's down by 11%. So I think if you were to take 11 or 12% away from 39, then you come with you're much closer to the 15% that PodTrack are seeing. So very much pointing to auto downloads being a bad thing, and the fact that Apple Podcasts has got rid of some of the auto downloads, but not all of them, is a good thing for us actually getting better numbers at the end of it.
So given that you want them to turn off auto downloads and have it as an opt-in rather than opt-out option, what would happen to the numbers if they did that?
Well, yeah, exactly. What would happen? I mean, I would suspect that we would see another massive drop, but at the very least, we would be able to turn around and say these download numbers pretty well equate to listens, which is what we can't say right now. So, I mean, there are technical ways of getting around that. Of course, there is a technical way of potentially when you download something, then you add something saying that this is an auto download, and then you send a head request when it actually gets played so that the podcast host knows that it's got played, and that would actually work. That would be IAB compliant as it is now. That would be backwards compatible and all of that. So you could actually do that right now if you wanted to. But easier and better given the amount of bandwidth that unlistened to auto downloads take up. I mean, you're talking millions of dollars a month to the podcast industry just to get rid of these automated auto downloads.
Now, moving on, Spotify. Spotify will add audiobooks, James, to Spotify premium users in Canada, Ireland and New Zealand. This was on top of the UK, US and Australia. What are they doing, James? Yeah,
well, they're doing exactly that. So if you're a Spotify premium listener, you get 15 hours of audiobooks free every month. You can now choose from 250,000 of them. And so all of that will happen. Basically, it looks as if it's every English-speaking country now. Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, US, UK and Australia, they're all grouped together for a good reason. And one wonders quite what's going to happen to French audiobooks. audiobooks and German audiobooks and everything else. They are talking about putting their prices up again, which is interesting, by either $1 or $2 a month in 5 markets by the end of April, including the UK, Australia and Pakistan, apparently. And it'll raise prices.
Pakistan, that well-known market.
That well-known market, that's a bizarre place, isn't it? That's a bizarre thing. And also, I have seen loads of people who subscribe to YouTube Music, but they subscribe to YouTube Music first by opening a VPN to India, where YouTube Music is like $3 a month instead of $15 a month. then they subscribe from there. And apparently that has worked absolutely flawlessly for a number of years, which is bizarre because your credit card says what country it's based in. And so it would be very easy for Google to stop that from happening. If you have an Australian or a UK credit card, you should not be using that in India to subscribe to YouTube Music. So I don't know. Who knows? But anyway, the idiots on the stock market think that this is a good idea. Spotify shares jumping 4.6% on the news to $281 a share.
It's 6 years ago that they did their IPO as well. So, share price. Look, share prices are always a reflection of what they think is future risk, and they think this is another revenue stream, so they're giving them a little nudge up. One of the interesting things, though, was some of the other plans that they've got for books. Was they were going to go and introduce a new basic tier. This will offer music and podcasts, but not audiobooks. It will stay at the current $11 a month pricing. And then they're going to add a supremium plan, which will finally, James, include the higher price to allow you to have access to high-fidelity audio.
Hi-fi audio?
Yes.
Wow. Have they actually announced that? Wow, there's a thing. I have to say, I've been listening to hi-fi audio on my Apple Music subscription, and what has really irritated me is that the Apple Music app on a Mac jumps after about 5 seconds of playing a track. There's a little jump as it finishes downloading the audio file, and then it starts playing off the audio file, and there's a little jump that you can hear every single time. It's really irritating, and it's a bug that has existed in that product for the last 3 years, and Apple has done nothing about it. But still, there we go. Spotify's market cap, by the way, $57.9 billion. So they're doing very well. I always find market caps are fascinating because you see large companies like Acast. Acast is on 176 million, right? So 176 million is pretty good. iHeartMedia, which also owns 1,200 radio stations in the US. iHeartMedia is just twice the amount of market cap as Acast, 303 million. If you look at Cumulus, just 52 million. And they still own a bunch of radio stations, just 52 million. So I always find it fascinating looking at all of the market caps and going, how much bigger, how much bigger is Acast in comparison to other people in the market? Audio Boom, market cap of $52 million. Podcast One, $50 million. So there you go.
Market cap's a really interesting review. I was listening to The Rest Is Money, and they were
the rest is ...
Yes. And they were talking about Vodafone 10 years ago was 10x the market cap of Apple, and after the failed acquisitions and merger plans that Vodafone have, Vodafone's now somewhere like 25 million, and Apple is 3 trillion. It was a total failure. So you can see how I guess failed plans lead to poor market caps and good plans lead to big market caps.
Yes, no, indeed.
Now, one of the other things that was announced in LA was the Podcast Academy. The Board of Governors have announced the new people on the Podcast Academy for 2024. Was this good, James?
Yes, I mean it's a yearly thing where they announce a bunch of new people on the Board of Governors. They also keep a bunch of people on the Board of Governors, so you have a bit of continuity there. I've worked out, and I won't go through every single member of the Board of Governors, partially because there are some in there that I have no idea how to pronounce. But I make it...
Go on!
I make it 19 people. 17 of whom are from the US. There's one from Colombia, one from the UK in there. Friend of the show, Ariel Nissenblatt, is one of those people. I know that she was very keen to be on the Board of Governors. And there's a bunch of other people. Steve Lack, who came to Pod News Live in London. He is also on that list, and a fair amount of other useful and interesting people on there as well. I would, be interested to know exactly what kind of work that they would do, and what benefits all of these people will bring to the Podcast Academy, which I don't see an awful lot from, to be honest. But nevertheless, I'm still a member, and so that's still going on. And Christy Meribal is the chair, Jen Sargent is the vice chair, Matty Stout is secretary, Sierra Reid is treasurer, and Ilana Susnow is whatever an at-large member is. But apparently that's a thing. So the at-large member is Ilana Susnow. Who have you any idea what an at-large member is?
Yeah. There was a guy called Mike Butcher who was at-large reporter for TechCrunch. It just meant they weren't particularly attached to one country, but they were interesting enough to keep a hold of and float around and say the right word. I'm on TechCrunch, or in this case, I guess I'm involved with the Podcast Academy in some form.
But I mean, if you're going to be on the board, then you're on the board. And Ilana only calls herself on her LinkedIn the Podcast Academy board member. So I don't quite understand what the difference is between that and an at-large member, and why she has been highlighted as being that. So perhaps that's something that I should maybe find out more about.
Meetings, I don't know, just doesn't want to attend. So the UK person is a friend of mine, Sangeeta Pillai, who does Soul Sisters, which is an award-winning podcast. So, I'll have a chat with her, what she thinks her role is, because she's new to it. She was over in LA, so I guess, it'll be interesting to see what she thinks the role for her will be. Because again, I had a word with Ariel, and I wind them up by calling it the American Podcast Awards. And I said, look, you either just be very clear, you're never going to focus on international, and it's just going to be a myopic look at the World Series of podcasting in America, or stop pretending and then really do something broader and bring the whole industry in, if that's what you think you are. And if that's what you think you are, then one podcast nominated from Singapore is not sufficient.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that the Ambies are one thing, and the Ambies, I think the original idea around that was that this was going to be a thing that was going to be on network television, and you would watch the Ambies and it would be an amazing thing. The fact that they just used a conference room at the hotel this year rather than hire a theatre, I think tells you how that plan is going. Not particularly well, but the Podcast Academy does many more things other than just the Ambies. And I think it's a case of looking at that part too. I mean, clearly, it's not going to be a very exciting event for American network TV if you've got all of these British people who you've no idea who they are, and Australians and Indians and people from Indonesia and people from Singapore. That's not going to make great TV, because you're not going to be seeing all of these big stars that you listen to every single week. So perhaps it needs to be an American focused thing, and maybe we should just get used to it. We do, of course, have the Australian Podcast Awards and the British Podcast Awards, which are very Australian and very British.
Yeah, and I said that to Ariel. Just stop pretending. Call it the American Podcast Awards and just get on with it. Anyway, moving on. Around the world, this is an interesting one, James. In Sweden, Podspace is now the second largest podcast platform and ad network. Who's Podspace?
Who is Podspace? I had not heard of Podspace, but they turn out to be pretty large. They're Sweden's fastest growing podcast platform in 2023. Of course, Acast comes from Sweden as well, so you can guess who number one is. So Podspace has signed up with a bunch of different people, bunch of different publishers in Sweden, including the big newspaper company Bonnier News, Make Sense Media, Kvartal, NTM, and a bunch of other of these services as well. And interesting to see a specific company based in Sweden doing very well. The CEO is called Carl Frijo, and the director of sales called Lucas Boo, which I'm a big fan of. And again, I think it's fascinating just seeing that for a relatively small place like Sweden, this company has just surpassed 1 million weekly unique listeners and is the number 2 in that market. I think it just does go to show that there are always interesting things going on outside of the US that we should be taking note of.
People News on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Stephanie Kuo has been named head of content, or rather VP of content at PRX, helping to lead both podcast and radio broadcast strategy. It's an internal promotion. She's been with the company since 2018. And a good friend of mine, Paul Chantler, has died after a short illness. Now, he was one of the original architects of the UK's podcast radio. He had said that he'd been diagnosed with cancer. I think it was liver cancer, and so we were worried for him then, but actually it turned out that it was a different illness that claimed him at the end of last week. He was a very good man, always used to turn up at radio conferences and podcast conferences in a black shirt, and he was always good for a chat and a laugh. So we will miss him. Paul Chantler dying this week, and he was 64.
Podcast events on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Now let's take a look at some events. The Webby Awards has announced the nominees for the 28th Annual Awards. The ceremony will be on May the 13th. Amber Ruffin, the comedian, writer and actor and podcaster. She has a podcast of her very own. She announced her appearance on Late Night with Seth Meyers, but it was the funniest thing in that essentially we were shared, the entire interview. And the entire interview was Amber and Seth, joking around about things. And then right at the end, Seth Meyers says something like, and you're hosting
the Webbies. That's a real thing.
Yeah, I'm hosting the Webbies. The Webbies are an awards show for the internet.
Oh, that's nice. Anyway, great to see you. It was just the weirdest thing.
You hosted the Webbies one.
I did.
Was it fun?
It was.
Did you love it?
I did.
Okay.
There you go.
Thanks.
Thank you.
No. Yeah, thank me.
Thank you for being here.
Bless them. But you can vote for the People's Choice if you want to, or the People's Voice it's called, in a number of podcast categories. Have I mentioned that I've won a People's Voice?
No, never heard of that.
Yes. So you can do that. Also, coming out the podcast show in London, which I will be at 22nd and 23rd of May. Be there early because I'm doing the opening keynote, and a new podcast festival in the UK, Crossed Wires, from May the 31st to June the 2nd. There is also a podcast summit going on in Toronto as part of Radio Days North America, which you should take a look at. Just do a Google search for Radio Days North America. There's a specific podcast day, which I think is on the Sunday in Toronto, the first Sunday of June. And again, I will be at that too, and looking forward to perhaps seeing you there. So if you're Canadian, firstly, sorry. And secondly, I will see you there.
Oh, no. Come on, James. Canadians, the nice Americans.
They are, exactly.
Yeah.
They're lovely people. And Toronto does very good beer. So I'm looking forward to that. And there is also a very good, although the conference hotel is awful, it's some West Inn hotel, which was built in the 80s and is dreadful. Directly opposite it is a very run-down and frankly quite dirty curry shop that sells the most amazing dosas. So I'm looking forward to eating there every lunchtime, going over there and having one of those chicken dosas, because my goodness, they're good. So there we are. There's a tip for the top. There are more events, both paid for and free, at Pod News, virtual events or events in a place with people, and it's podnews.net/events if you want to learn more.
The tech stuff on the Pod News Weekly Review.
Yes, it's the stuff you'll find every Monday in the Pod News newsletter. Here's where Sam talks technology. What have you got for us this week, Sam?
Well, I don't normally, but I'm actually really super proud of what we've achieved. We at TrueFans have enabled one-click in-app purchase of Sats via Apple Pay or Google Pay. So if anyone has ever tried to top up their wallet with Sats, you've known that you've had to open a bank account with somebody like MoonPay, do KYC, know your customer, tell them who your firstborn child was, and then eventually they allow you to have an account where you can top up your wallet. And let's be honest, no one was doing it. And I'm not surprised no one was doing it. So we managed to work out, without going through Apple Store or being an iOS app, how you can do one-click in-app purchase. So you say, I want $4.99 or £3 or 10 Aussie dollars, and you just simply see how many sats that is. You click it on your iPhone or your Google phone, and they appear instantly in your wallet.
So instantly in what, in my Albi wallet or in right? Okay, so you're essentially you're buying stuff, you're buying Sats, you're then transferring those Sats straight through to my Albi wallet. So you're not actually keeping any of this, money.
Nope.
It's just as simple as that, is it?
Very simple, yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. And so, and so you can just go away and do that with Apple Pay, Google Pay, or just with a normal credit card. And,
exactly.
And the job is a good thing. That sounds like an excellent plan. I wonder why nobody else has done that.
Don't know. Everything's obvious in hindsight, James, is what I like to say.
Yes, exactly.
Now, Ali2 has added video calling in its remote recording app. Tell me more.
Yes, if this is quite neat in that Ali2, which is a very smart set of tools that allow you to record podcasts, they've just added video calling so you can see the person who you're talking to. It'll still just record the audio for now, but you can actually see who you're talking to, which makes for a better conversation normally. Not that we can see each other, Sam, but we never used to look anyway. So, there is always
7 o'clock in the morning, I'm not at my best, James.
No, well, there you go.
7 o'clock at night, I'm not at my best either. But
So Ali2 will record the video soon as well. That's coming later in the year, but it's a very smart little system. If you don't really fancy doing an awful lot of editing for yourself and you want to leave it to the Ali2 audio cleanup and editor, then you can do that. Worth a peek. Spreaker seems to be doing well. According to Livewire's share of new episodes, Spreaker had a significant jump in March, which is interesting. I did notice that Spreaker started using PodPing in late February, early March. So my suspicion is that it's tied into that. And so if you are listening and you want to make sure that you are nice and high in that list that Livewire, that John Spurlock puts together every single month, then make sure that you do PodPing. Seems to make an awful lot of sense because, of course, it'll mean that his systems will see every single new episode that you produce. So that might be the reason why. But it's a good piece of data. To be honest, I would much rather see numbers of episodes rather than share, because I think numbers of episodes are rather more interesting. But even so, we're seeing share at the moment and Spreaker seeming to be doing very well there.
Now, you mentioned it earlier, Pocket Cast is readying support for Podcast 2.0 JSON chapters, which is great news. Ellie was there at the Podcast Standards board meeting and hoping that Ellie will now come onto this show and tell us more about what Pocket Casts are planning to do. I'd also like to talk to her, and she may not be the right person to find out what Automatic or WordPress, I mean, depending on which name they want to pick, are doing with the Activity Pub stuff as well, because I think it's all getting mixed in. WordPress are in a very good position with Pocket Casts and the stuff they're doing with the Activity Pub. They also have Tumblr, if I remember rightly, as well, which
that's right,
also claimed that it was going to be a federated client in the Activity Pub network.
Yes, I think they claimed that, and then I think they've realised that it's impossible to make money out of Tumblr. So they, from what I understand about it, they're not really doing very much with that anymore. I think they're in a great place, and I think it'll be really interesting to see. Pocket Cast is a great app. It's one of the ones that I'm recommending after Google Podcast closed in the US.
Now, can I just point out, Mr. Cridland?
Oh, here we go.
Who's your partner for the last 3 years on Pod News Weekly? Who gets up every morning, right?
Yes.
Any mention of true fans in that list? No.
No, not specifically in a list for who would you replace Google Podcasts or Stitcher with?
Well, two of my other competitors get a nudge and a link. Can I just say?
Yes, I think that's the difficulty. There is these aren't what I consider to be the best podcast apps. These are the podcast apps which are the closest experience to Google or to that's Stitcher. Fine. But yes, I hear what you're saying. Moving on, pod rolls. Pod rolls are good, aren't they?
They're great. Now, you coming out of a bar, James, talking to Justin Jackson from Transistor, there was a little idea that the pair of you dreamed up. What was it?
Yes, so pod rolls. So not very many people are currently doing pod rolls in their podcasts at the moment. So just to rewind a little bit, a pod roll is essentially a link to another podcast. It's a stupid name. You don't have to use it in your UX. Don't worry about that. But it's just a way of linking to another podcast that you recommend. So this podcast, for example, links to the Buzzsprout podcast, Buzzcast. It's not one that we do, but it's one that we recommend because Buzzsprout is our sponsor. That's how it works. So pod rolls are good. There aren't too many podcasts that are using them at the moment. In my sample, it's about 500, which is fine, but still it's a good start. But one of the things that Justin just sort of mentioned, actually it was after the Podcast Standards Project board meeting, is he said, pod rolls are really cool because you can actually use those for discovery in podcast apps, particularly even if a podcast hasn't got a pod roll of its own. You can show the other podcasts that have linked to that podcast, a bit like, Google's PageRank, basically. And so you could actually use that for discovery. And I thought, isn't that a good idea? I should go and code that. And it turned out to be much harder to code than I was expecting because it basically caned my database. But after refiguring out how to do the database, it works really nicely. So there are shows, for example, that Adam Curry is linking to from No Agenda that don't have a pod roll of their own. So now we're able to actually say, under other shows you may enjoy, we can say that show is recommended by No Agenda, for example. I think it's a really cool thing, and you can begin to build some quite interesting ways of finding new content using the pod roll. So it's one of the Podcast Standards Project's favoured tags, and I look forward to more people supporting it.
I like this idea so much. We thought we'd try it as well. So I'll be sending you some screenshots to see how it looks.
There you go.
Because I think it's a great little idea. I mean, it's so obvious in hindsight again that if you don't have a pod roll, but you're featured elsewhere. And what's really interesting, and we haven't done anything with it, you might do something with it, is you can create a chart eventually which shows which podcasts are featured elsewhere, and you can get numbers of popularity around podcasts then.
Yeah, exactly. And that's something that I wanted to do. Haven't yet actually spent the time to do that, but it is something that I wanted to end up doing. So being able to work out what the most recommended podcast is, being able to work out, all of those podcasts that are linked to that aren't linking back, all of that kind of stuff, it should be really interesting. So, and as I say, it's the basis of how Google worked. It is PageRank. It's people making a choice to link to another, in this case, podcast, and works really well. So for those grumpy people who are saying Podroll's a rubbish name, brilliant. Completely agree. You don't have to use it in your UX. I think Buzzsprout just says other shows you may enjoy, and then underneath it says recommended by this podcaster, not an algorithm. And I think that's absolutely right.
So are we not going to have the word pod rank then?
I mean, back in 2005, I tried to use the word podvertising, and thankfully that hasn't worked either.
Yeah, I tried to use the word pod lifting at the podcast Evolutions. When you listen to a show and you don't pay, you're pod lifting, a bit like shoplifting.
Yes. Anyway,
didn't go down well. No, didn't go down well either.
Anyway, Rephonic,
yes.
It has now integrated with OP3, which is good. So if you use Rephonic to try and work out what shows you want to be advertising on and blah, 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 then if they are using OP3, then you actually see their verified download figures. That's exactly how OP3 should be used. So that's very nice. And Rephonic is also using Spotify's rankings as well. So if you 5-star this show in Spotify, then Rephonic will grab that. Good news, so does Pod News. So if you see the overall star rating at the top, then that now includes star ratings if they exist in Spotify as well. So there's a good thing because we take our data from Rephonic on that. John Spurlock is talking about cross-app comments for podcast apps using ActivityPub like Mastodon, which is lovely. The Pod News Daily has done that for a while, so give that a go. I'm not quite sure what's new there, other than is there anything new?
John and I had a good old chat while I was out in LA, and we basically realised that you can take the activity stream from the app and you can publish that with permission to your Mastodon or Plex or any other ActivityPub client. We couldn't work out where we were going to aggregate all of this if we wanted to do cross-app comments, and John came up with the idea of the social interact tags. So fundamentally, the creator would say, this is where I want to aggregate commentary around this episode, and therefore all the apps could publish to that same point, and then a bit like a pod ping, but you don't have to because it's an ActivityPub relay. You would just listen to that post. And therefore,
but have we not? So that's different to linking to a Mastodon post, is it?
Yes, yeah. Because what we're doing is we're trying to say that everyone aggregates around this. It's called a shared collection. So look, there's a lot of stuff that still isn't worked out, but we're starting to look at how we can do this. So if you can imagine somebody in Podverse and somebody in Fountain make a comment, and then I can see that in that shared social interact tag, and I could aggregate that back. Now,
but you can see that in the replies to the base Mastodon post, can't you?
If you go to the podcast
that's
index.
Different, is it?
Yeah. So we're trying to look at boosts, we're trying to look at comments, and Adam is going to scream at me now and say boost are not comments, and they're not. And okay, I get it, Adam. One's a comment is simply no payment with it, and one's a boost with a payment, right? They are different things. So
well, one's a payment with a comment attached. Is I believe the phrase.
Yes. So they are different. I hadn't realised certain things. When you go onto the podcast index page and you look at a certain podcast, you can see the comments. If you went and looked at No Agenda, you would see a threaded comment stream there. So I think, look, we're trying to work out how we can get to the fabled cross-app comment, and maybe this is one way of doing it, is to use the social interact tag. It's super early days, so I haven't got all the details. We are trying to work out it and cross T's and dot I's, but we'll get there. We will get there.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning more when it gets simple enough for me to actually understand what's actually going on there.
Final little bit of fun. iOS 17.5, the beta was out yesterday, and they've added the color-changing Apple Podcast widget. It's back. So there you go. James, you can add that to your flashy iPhone 15 Pro Max.
Yes, I've already done it. My iPhone 15 Plus. Yes, I've already done it. Yes, and that's very exciting. Wow, it's a color-changing widget that takes the color from the image, which I must find out how that works, because it must be relatively easy to programmatically do that. Yes, very exciting. Hooray. iOS 17.5 probably coming out in May, and it is the version of iOS that will allow you to install an app from a website if you're in Europe. So that'll be a thrill. And finally, Podscan.fm is a new service which notifies you immediately when a podcast mentions a brand or something that you are in charge of. So you can see what people are saying about your particular brand online. It's quite interesting. It's not measuring every single podcast out there yet, but certainly looks like an interesting thing.
Yeah, does anyone else do that? I'm sure they do. Doesn't?
Yes, I think there's a bunch of different tools which are, brand management tools for podcasts, and it's always good to see more people jumping into this space, just so you can really watch what people are saying about your particular, brand or your particular, service online. That's always a good thing, I think.
Boostergram Corner
On the Pod News Weekly Review.
Yes, it's our favourite time of the week. It's Boostergram Corner. Good news, my umbrella's working again. So it stopped working while I was away because there was a big power cut. And there seems to be, and I don't know whether there's a thing that will fix this, but it seems that when the power comes back on, then my router starts connecting, but it tries connecting to the modem, which is still booting up. And because the modem is still booting up, it can't get a DHCP address, and so therefore it doesn't work. And so it just sits there in a state of paralysis until I yank the power out and stick the power back in again. There must be a way of fixing that. If anybody knows, I would love to know that. James@crid.land. Anyway, what boosts have we got this week, Sam?
Well, RW Nash sent us 1,000 sats, said, listening to you talking about Adam Curry, who's talking about you. Yes, very
Hooray!
meta. Yes, very meta indeed, yes.
Yes, it's very meta. Thank you, RW Nash. And I should tell you that now Adam Curry has just listened to us, talking about Adam Curry, who was talking about us. So it's just got even more meta because Adam listens to this show most weeks. Gene Bean, bravo, Sam. I'm looking forward to seeing you get the Podcast Standards project moving forward. A row of ducks, 2222 sats. Thank you, Gene. That's good.
Brian Ensminger has said, I really wish Libsyn would support more 2.0 features natively. So do we. That's never going to happen. They were instrumental early on, and many people trust their industry stats. But as there becomes a wider divide related to podcasting 2.0, which they don't do natively with support, there will be a gap in the reported impact of 2.0 apps. I hope more companies start publishing platform stats. And he says 1701 sats, which 1701, James, there has to be an etymology to that one.
Anyway, 1701 is a Star Trek boost, obviously. So there you go. Obviously, I've got no idea why.
Obviously.
Kyron from the Mere Mortals podcast. Funny you mentioned. Oh, and by the way, I should just say, Brian, to your point, yes, I do not understand why Libsyn is so averse to putting any new innovations into podcasting. They are a dying podcast host. Fewer and fewer people are using them, primarily because they haven't bothered innovating on anything over the last 5 or 6 years. I think it will kill the company, and probably the best plan that we can actually think right now is that the company ends up going bust and gets taken over by somebody that that knows what they're doing. That clearly isn't the case in terms of senior management at that company, at least in the podcasting senior management. And I suspect that it will kill them. So that's my view. Karin from the Mere Mortals podcast. Funny, he says, moving on. Funny you mentioned the long tail. This week's Value for Value episode, Value for Value, available in your favourite podcast app and in Spotify. This week's Value for Value episode is all about that. What other books, all about the long tail, what other books would you two recommend to know more or predict where technology is taking us? What books would you recommend to talk about where technology is taking us, Sam?
Well, I mean, many of the books that I think are worth dusting down, a lot of them are, older books that, I think people should look at. I mean, I know Karin's done The Inevitable, which is Kevin Kelly's book, which was a really good read about the future of the internet, and which is what Value for Value, and a lot of other things are based around. Adam will tell you it's not based around that book and it's not based around Kevin Kelly, but from someone who's read Kevin Kelly's blogs and The Inevitable itself and some of his other works, that would be one of those that I would do, but I know Karin's already reviewed that. I'll come back to you, Karin, with a list of other books.
Yes, there you go. One book I would recommend, because I finished reading it on the plane on the way back, Number Go Up, Inside Crypto's Wild Rise and Staggering Fall. It's possibly not for you if you're a massive fan of all things crypto, but in terms of a good read, it's quite fascinating, talking about Sam Bankman-Fried and all kinds of other people. It's by Zeke Foe, who is the improbably named author, and it's a very good book and highly recommended. So go off and read that. Yes, gosh, there's a thing. And Karin also says, I missed last week's boost, ran out of sats while streaming. Yay! And that interview with Gotham was fantastic. Loved this episode. That's the last episode. No, it's not. It's an episode a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, he says, thank you, Sam. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sats. Oh, that's almost a big baller, isn't it?
Yes.
And, if only I had the big baller.
Is that copyrighted?
Jingle. I mean, it is, but seemingly nobody's actually cared. But yes. There we go. Thank you, Karin. That's very kind of you. And yes, excellent. So, what's happened for you this week, Sam?
I had a lovely interview with E.B. Moss. Thank you so much. Enjoyed doing that with her.
She's good, isn't she? Yes.
Yeah, it was great fun. So episode 18's out. If you want to listen to what Todd and I have got to say about the future of podcasting. And I just did a really fun interview with Barry from Podhome. He's got his new podcast out. So yeah, I'm trying to get around all the podcasts and spread the word if I can.
Yes, which is always a good thing. What was E.B. Moss's podcast called?
Oh, Insider Interviews, James, yeah.
Insider Interviews. Excellent. Well, worth a listen.
What's happened for you, James?
Well, I fixed my Umbrel, so that's good news. Umbrel also has, if you're using Umbrel as a Bitcoin node or a Lightning node on your, on your home network using a Raspberry Pi, Umbrel has a brand new OS, which is very lovely. I think it's finally OS 1.0. For Umbrel. I think it is. Anyway, it all looks very fancy. They've done a lot of work on it. It looks very smart. It was very easy to upgrade. I didn't need to download the entire blockchain again, which was a welcome relief to everybody. So hooray for them. And yes, so that's now up and running. I did notice that the good folk at the Podcast Index had force closed my channel. How dare they? Possibly because my node was off for a week or so. But anyway, so I've just reopened a large channel to them. So we'll see if that's actually opened again by the time that this goes. In fact, it's online now, which is good. So that's all nice. Anyway, that's it for this week. You can also listen to the Pod News Daily, which is a little bit more focused than this podcast has been this week. And you can subscribe to the Pod News newsletter for more of these stories and much more. It's at podnews.net.
What are you saying, James? I don't know. What are you saying? You can give feedback to James and I by sending this show a Boostergram. If your podcast app doesn't support Boost, then grab a new app from podcasting2.org/apps.
Our music is from Studio Dragonfly. Our voiceover is Sheila D. We record using Clean Feed, and we're hosted and sponsored by Buzzsprout. Podcast hosting made easy.
Get updated every day. Subscribe to our newsletter at podnews.net. Tell your friends and grow the show.
And support us.
The Pod News Weekly Review will return next week. Keep listening.